You ever ask a question you can't take back, Captain? The voice didn't rise, didn't challenge, but it cut clean through the low murmur of the Marine briefing room like a blade sliding through still water, and for a moment, even the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to hesitate. Captain Ryan Cole leaned back against the metal table, arms crossed, a half-smile playing on his lips as he looked the old man up and down, taking in the faded green jacket, the scuffed boots, the way time had settled into the lines of his face without ever breaking the steadiness in his pale blue eyes. The room smelled faintly of gun oil and fresh coffee. A dozen Marines standing in loose formation, their posture relaxed but their attention sharpening as the tension coiled tighter. "Relax, sir," Cole said, voice edged with amusement. "Just trying to figure out who wandered into my briefing." A couple of younger Marines chuckled under their breath, one nudging another as if they were watching a harmless show unfold. The old man didn't react, didn't shift his weight, didn't offer explanation. He simply stood there as if the noise, the rank, the room itself existed somewhere far behind his gaze. Near the back, Staff Sergeant Lucas Grant felt something settle wrong in his gut, a quiet instinct honed over years that didn't come from manuals or rank insignia. His eyes drifting to the small, worn patch stitched crookedly on the old man's chest, the fabric frayed. The symbol faded almost beyond recognition, but not entirely. Cole pushed off the table, boots echoing against the polished floor as he stepped closer, closing the distance with the casual confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong. "All right," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Let's make this easy." He gestured loosely at the old man. "What unit? What clearance? Or better yet?" His smirk widened just enough to draw another ripple of quiet laughter from the room. "What's your call sign?" The question hung there, light on the surface, heavy underneath. A test disguised as a joke. Grant's fingers tightened subtly at his sides, his attention locking onto the old man now, the air shifting in a way he couldn't explain, like the moment before a storm breaks over open ground. The old man's gaze moved, slow and deliberate, not to Cole, but past him, as if measuring something deeper than the room, deeper than the moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of something that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Iron Viper." The words landed softly, almost lost in the space between them. But the effect was immediate. The faint crackle of a nearby radio snapped. Sharp, a burst of static that made one Marine glance down instinctively. Another screen flickered on the far console without being touched, and Grant felt the blood drain from his face as recognition hit not like a thought, but like memory forced back into the present. Cole blinked once, the smirk still there but faltering at the edges. "Yeah," he started, a short breath of disbelief slipping into his tone. "That's..." But he didn't finish, because somewhere down the hall, heavy doors slammed open, the sound echoing with a force that didn't belong to routine, and the entire room felt it before they saw him. That shift, that presence, the unmistakable gravity of authority moving fast and without announcement. Grant straightened instinctively, spine locking, heart pounding, while Cole turned just slightly, confusion flickering across his face for the first time. The old man didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the sudden change. He simply stood there, as if he had been waiting all along, as if the room was finally catching up to something he had never left behind. The doors did not just open, they parted with a force that carried authority ahead of it, and every Marine in the room felt it before they understood it. Boots striking the polished floor in a rhythm that erased conversation, erased posture, erased certainty. General Victor Maddox entered without announcement, his uniform immaculate, his presence filling the space like pressure before a storm. And the moment he crossed the threshold, conversations died mid-breath, shoulders straightened, and instinct took over as every Marine snapped to attention except one. Arthur Hale did not move. Captain Ryan Cole turned. Fully now, confusion tightening his jaw, his earlier confidence faltering under the sudden weight of something he could not yet define. "Sir," he began, voice catching just slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. But the general did not acknowledge him, not even a glance, his eyes locked instead on the old man standing quietly near the center of the room. Staff Sergeant Lucas Grant felt his pulse hammering in his ears, every instinct screaming confirmation of what he already feared. This was no misunderstanding, no coincidence. This was something far above rank, far beyond protocol. The faint crackle of the radio continued in the background, no longer subtle, a persistent whisper of static that seemed to react to the presence in the room. General Maddox slowed as he approached, each step deliberate, measured, as if crossing an invisible line that no one else could see. And when he finally stopped a few feet in front of Arthur Hale, the entire room held its breath. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, no words, no orders, just silence stretching tight across the space like a drawn wire. And then, with absolute precision, the general raised his hand and rendered a perfect salute. The motion was sharp, controlled, and carried a weight that no speech could match. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Marines who had faced pressure before felt something entirely different settle over them. A realization that shifted everything they thought they understood about the man in front of them. Grant followed without hesitation, his own salute snapping into place. And within a heartbeat, the entire room moved as one, a wave of discipline driven not by command, but by recognition. Captain Cole stood frozen, his arms still at his sides, the meaning of what he was witnessing colliding with the reality he had just created moments earlier, his voice gone, his authority stripped not by force, but by truth. Arthur Hale did not return the salute. Immediately, his eyes resting on the general with a calm that spoke of familiarity rather than surprise, as if this moment had already happened somewhere long ago under very different skies. The hum of the lights returned, softer now, distant, as the weight of silence settled deeper, and when Arthur finally moved, it was not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate, his hand rising just enough to acknowledge the gesture, not as a response to rank, but as a quiet acceptance of something earned long before anyone in that room had ever worn a uniform. General Maddox lowered his hand slowly. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying across the room without needing volume. "Permission to speak." "Freely, sir," he said, not to the captain, not to the room, but to the old man standing in front of him. And in that moment, every Marine present understood that whatever had just been triggered by two simple words was far from over. Arthur Hale did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any command that had been spoken in that room all morning. His eyes steady on General Maddox as if measuring not the rank, not the uniform, but the man behind it. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained low, controlled, almost reflective. "You already know you do not need permission." The words landing softly, but the effect rippled outward, a subtle shift that tightened every spine still locked at attention. General Maddox inclined his head just slightly, not as a superior acknowledging a subordinate, but as one professional recognizing another, and that distinction did not go unnoticed by Staff Sergeant Grant, whose breathing had steadied into something deliberate, focused, as he watched the exchange unfold with growing clarity. Captain Ryan Cole remained rooted where he stood, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet, creeping realization that he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding, his eyes moving between the general and the old man, searching for context that refused to present itself. The faint static from the radio intensified for a brief moment, then stabilized into a steady tone, as if whatever had been triggered had now locked into place. General Maddox turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping the room just once, not to command, but to confirm, and every Marine felt it. The unspoken order to remain exactly as they were, witnesses to something rare, something not written in manuals or taught in training. He stepped closer to Arthur Hale, closing the last few feet with deliberate care, his voice lowering further, though every word carried clearly across the room. "We have not heard that call sign in over 30 years, he said, and for the first time, there was something beneath the authority, something quieter, almost personal, not since it was flagged under legacy command protocols. A murmur threatened to rise among the Marines, but discipline held it in place. The tension now coiled tighter than before. Arthur's expression did not change, but his gaze drifted for a fraction of a second, not to the people, not to the room, but somewhere far beyond it, as if the words had brushed against something older than memory, something carried rather than recalled. Grant swallowed slowly. the pieces beginning to align in a way that made his pulse quicken. Legacy protocol was not a term used lightly, not something attached to ordinary service. It belonged to operations that existed in fragments, in whispers, in records that were never fully explained. Captain Cole shifted his weight unconsciously, the movement small but noticeable in a room where stillness had become absolute, and for the first time, uncertainty edged into his voice as he spoke. Sir, with respect, I was just asking a question. But even as the words left him, they felt hollow, disconnected from the reality that had taken hold. General Maddox did not look at him, did not acknowledge the attempt to regain footing. His focus remained entirely on Arthur Hale. They told us if we ever heard it again, he continued, we were to stand down all assumptions and verify directly. His jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign of the weight behind his words. No delay, no interpretation. The room seemed to draw in tighter around them. Every Marine, now fully aware that they were standing inside something far larger than a routine briefing. Arthur let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and when he finally spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but carried a quiet finality. Then you know what comes next. And for the first time since entering the room, General Maddox did not respond immediately, because whatever came next was not just procedure, it was history waiting to be acknowledged. General Maddox held that silence for a fraction longer than anyone expected, as if weighing something that could not be measured by rank or protocol. And when he finally moved, it was not with urgency, but with precision, turning slightly toward the far end of the room where a secured terminal sat dark against the wall, its screen dormant until now. Staff Sergeant Grant, he said quietly, and the name carried enough authority to snap the moment forward. Grant stepped out from formation. Immediately, his boots striking the floor with controlled urgency, crossing the distance in a straight line, his mind already ahead of his body, already anticipating what would be required. The Marines watched without moving, their discipline holding them in place, but their attention locked onto every detail, every shift, every word that hinted at something far beyond their understanding. Grant reached the terminal and hesitated for only a second, his hand hovering over the interface. Then he entered a sequence that was not standard, not something used in daily operations, a string of commands that triggered a low hum beneath the surface of the machine. The screen flickered to life, not with the usual clean interface, but with a stripped-down display, black background, white text, stark and direct, and for a moment, nothing happened, just a blinking cursor, steady and patient. Captain Cole watched from across the room, his jaw tightening again, his instincts telling him to step in, to reassert control. But something deeper held him back, something in the way the general stood, in the way Grant moved, in the way the room itself had shifted around the old man. Then the terminal responded, not with a menu, not with options, but with a single line of text that appeared letter by letter as if being confirmed in real time, and Grant felt his breath catch as he read it, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. Identity flag acknowledged, the words, sending a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable. The static on the radio ceased completely, replaced by a clean, silent channel, as if whatever had been searching had now found exactly what it was looking for. General Maddox stepped closer to the terminal, his eyes scanning the screen for less than a second before returning to Arthur Hale. And there was no doubt now, no uncertainty left to interpret. Protocol Iron Viper, the general said, his voice steady, formal, and carrying a weight that pressed down on every Marine present, status verified and active. The words settled into the room like a final piece locking into place, and even those who did not fully understand felt the shift, the recognition that they were standing in the presence of something preserved, something that had endured quietly for decades without needing acknowledgement. Arthur remained still, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle release in his posture, not relief, not pride, but the quiet acceptance of something long set aside now being called forward again. Grant stepped back from the terminal slowly, his eyes never leaving the screen, the gravity of what he had just confirmed settling into his chest, while Captain Cole finally took a step forward, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. Sir, what exactly is Protocol Iron Viper? The question hung there, no longer mocking, no longer casual, but genuine, searching. General Maddox did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on Arthur Hale as if the explanation did not belong to him alone, and for a moment, the room held its breath once more, waiting, because whatever came next was not just information, it was a story that had been silent for far too long. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment no one moved to answer it, not because they could not, but because the weight of it demanded precision. General Maddox finally shifted his stance slightly, not turning away from Arthur Hale, but acknowledging the room just enough for his voice to carry with controlled authority. "It is not a protocol you study in training," he said, each word measured. "And it is not one you activate by accident." His eyes flicked briefly toward Captain Cole, not with reprimand, but with a clarity that cut deeper than correction. The Marines remained still, but their focus sharpened further, every instinct telling them they were standing at the edge of something rarely spoken. Maddox continued. "Iron Viper was a contingency designation." He paused, as if selecting what could be said and what would remain unsaid. "A safeguard tied to individuals, not systems." The distinction hung in the air, unfamiliar but unmistakably important. Staff Sergeant Grant felt a chill run beneath his uniform, his mind racing through fragments of briefings he had once dismissed as theoretical, references to legacy assets that were never fully explained, never fully documented, because they were never meant to be understood in ordinary terms. Arthur Hale remained quiet, his gaze steady, allowing the explanation to unfold without interruption, as if he had heard variations of it before, as if the words themselves were only an outline of something far more complex. Captain Cole took another step forward, slower this time, his voice lower, stripped of any trace of earlier arrogance. "Sir, you are saying this is about him?" The question was careful now, deliberate, and for the first time, it carried respect rather than challenge. General Maddox nodded once, a small motion that carried absolute certainty. "Yes," he said, "this is about him." And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any detailed explanation could. The room seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with recognition, the kind that does not require full understanding to be felt. Maddox turned his attention fully back to Arthur, his voice lowering further. "When a call sign like that is spoken, we do not question it," he said. "We confirm it, and we respond." His jaw set slightly, the discipline in his posture reinforcing the meaning behind the words. Grant's eyes moved between the two men, the realization settling deeper now. This was not about rank, not about authority in the conventional sense. This was about something preserved, something carried forward quietly through years that had erased almost everything else. Captain Cole exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his earlier confidence now replaced by a growing awareness of how little he had understood just minutes ago. "And what does responding mean, sir?" he asked, the question no longer casual, no longer careless. General Maddox did not answer immediately, his gaze holding on Arthur Hale, as if the next words required more than protocol, required acknowledgement, and in that pause, the entire room felt it again, that same stillness. That same sense that whatever came next would not just explain the present, but reach back into a past that had never truly been left behind. General Maddox let the silence stretch just long enough for every man in the room to feel the weight of the question. Then he spoke, his voice lower now, not carrying command, but something older, something earned. "Responding means we remember," he said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet gravity that no one dared interrupt. Captain Ryan Cole frowned slightly, not in defiance, but in confusion, trying to reconcile the simplicity of the answer with the magnitude of everything unfolding in front of him. "Remember what, sir?" he asked carefully. And this time, the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of a story too large to see all at once. General Maddox did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to the worn patch on Arthur Hale's jacket, the faded stitching catching the overhead light in a way that made it seem almost out of place among the sharp lines of modern uniforms. "We remember who built the ground. We stand on," he said finally, each word deliberate. "And we remember who walked it before us when no one else could." The Marines listened in absolute stillness now, not because they fully understood, but because they felt the truth behind it. Staff Sergeant Grant's throat tightened slightly, the pieces continuing to align in his mind, not as facts, but as a pattern. A recognition that this was not about one man stepping into a room, but about something that had been carried forward quietly, through time, waiting for the moment it needed to be. Seen again. Arthur Hale shifted his weight just slightly, the movement subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it drew the general's full attention, and for the first time, there was a hint of something personal in Maddox's expression, something that went beyond duty. "Sir," he said, the word deliberate, directed. "We have a standing directive tied to your designation." The room seemed to tighten again at that. The idea of a directive connected not to rank, not to position, but to a name, to a call. Sign, settling into the minds of every Marine present. Captain Cole exhaled slowly, his earlier posture gone, replaced by something more grounded, more aware. "What kind of directive?" he asked, his voice steady now, but careful, respectful. General Maddox did not look away from Arthur as he answered. "If the call sign is verified, command authority defers," he said, and the words landed with a quiet finality that shifted the entire structure of the room without a single visible movement. Grant felt his pulse quicken again, the meaning of that statement cutting clean through any remaining uncertainty. This was not symbolic. This was not ceremonial. This was operational. Arthur's eyes lifted slightly, meeting the general's, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not belong to this room, or this time, but to something much older, something carried forward through memory rather than record. Captain Cole's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, the realization settling in fully now, his earlier question, his tone, his assumption, all of it replaying in his mind with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. And when he looked back up, it was different, the confidence still there, but reshaped, grounded in understanding rather than assumption. The room remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been spoken. And yet, beneath that silence, there was a sense building, quiet but undeniable, that whatever this directive truly meant had not fully revealed itself yet, that the story behind those two words, Iron Viper, was still waiting, just beneath the surface, for the moment it would finally be told. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into something heavier than discipline, something closer to reverence. And for the first time since he had entered the room, Arthur Hale shifted his gaze across the Marines standing before him, not inspecting, not judging, but observing in a way that made each man feel seen beyond rank and uniform. General Maddox remained still, allowing the moment to hold, because whatever came next did not belong to command structure. It belonged to the man who had carried that call sign long before any of them had earned their place here. Arthur drew in a slow breath, the kind that seemed to pull memory with it. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, but it carried with it a depth that changed the air in the room. "It was never supposed to be remembered," he said, the words quiet, almost reflective, and yet every Marine heard them clearly. Staff Sergeant Grant felt his chest tighten slightly, his attention locking in even further, because this was no longer about protocol or verification. This was the beginning of something that had been buried by time. Arthur's eyes moved briefly to the terminal, its dim glow steady now, as if waiting. "We were told it would end with us," he continued. "No records, no recognition, just silence." The Marines remained motionless, but their focus sharpened, drawn in by the weight behind each word. Captain Ryan Cole stood still, his earlier misjudgment pressing against him, but he did not look away, did not retreat, because something in him understood that this moment was not about his mistake. It was about what he was being allowed to witness. Arthur's gaze returned to the room, passing over the faces of men who had trained for clarity, for certainty, and now stood in the presence of something deliberately left undefined. Iron Viper was not a name, he said. It was a line. He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. A line that did not move, no matter what stood in front of it. The words did not describe action. They described presence, and that distinction carried more weight than any story of conflict could have. General Maddox's posture remained rigid, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a recognition that went beyond briefing knowledge, beyond files and classifications, something closer to respect shaped by understanding. Grant swallowed slowly, his mind filling in the spaces between the words, not with details, but with implication, with the realization that some roles were never meant to be explained because they were never meant to be repeated. Arthur let the silence return, not as an absence, but as a continuation, his presence steady, grounded, and when he spoke again, it was softer still. When the line was gone, he said, so was everything behind it. The room held that statement carefully, as if even thinking too loudly might disturb it. Captain Cole felt something shift inside him, not fear, not uncertainty, but perspective, the understanding that what he had dismissed minutes ago was not just experience. It was history carried in a form he had never been trained to recognize. General Maddox finally inclined his head once more, a gesture small but deliberate. And now it stands again, he said quietly, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. And in that moment, every Marine in the room understood that the story they were beginning to hear was not about the past alone. It was about why that past had just stepped back into the present. The room did not relax, it adjusted, as if every man present had instinctively stepped into a formation that had no name, but carried absolute clarity. And Arthur Hale stood at the center of it without moving, without commanding, without needing to, his presence alone redefining the space. Captain Ryan Cole lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in shame, but in recalibration. The kind that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him was never as simple as he believed. And when he looked back up, it was different, sharper, quieter. Sir, he said, his voice steady now, directed not at rank, but at Arthur himself. I did not understand. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were not an excuse. They were recognition. Arthur studied him for a moment, not judging, not dismissing, but measuring something deeper. And then he gave a small nod, the kind that did not erase the moment, but acknowledged the shift within it. General Maddox watched the exchange closely, his posture unchanged, but there was a subtle easing in the set of his shoulders, not relaxation, but confirmation that the moment had landed where it needed to. Staff Sergeant Grant remained near the terminal, his eyes still flicking occasionally to the screen, where the words Protocol Iron Viper remained steady, unchanged, as if time itself had paused around them. The Marines stood silent, but no longer uncertain, their attention now anchored not in confusion, but in awareness, each of them understanding that they had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Arthur turned slightly then, his gaze moving across the room once more, and there was something different in it now, not distance, but presence, as if he had stepped fully into the moment rather than simply standing within it. You train for control, he said quietly, his voice carrying without force, for precision, for response. The Marines listened without shifting, the words aligning with everything they had been taught, everything they had built themselves around. Arthur paused just long enough for the rhythm to settle, then continued. But there are moments when none of that matters. The statement did not challenge their training, it reframed it, and that distinction held them even tighter. Captain Cole felt the words land deeper than he expected. Not as correction, but as expansion, as if something he had relied on had just been placed into a larger context. Arthur's eyes rested briefly on the worn patch on his own jacket, the fabric carrying years without explanation, and then he looked back up. What matters, he said, is whether you hold the line when there is nothing left to hold it for. The room absorbed the words in complete silence. Because this was not instruction, it was truth carried through time. General Maddox inclined his head once more, a gesture that acknowledged not just the words, but the weight behind them. That is why the protocol exists, he said, his voice steady, reinforcing the meaning without diminishing it. Not to give authority, but to recognize it. The distinction settled firmly, reshaping everything that had come before. Captain Cole drew in a slow breath, the air in the room feeling different now, heavier, clearer, and when he spoke again, it was with a level of control that matched the moment. Then what happens now? He asked, the question no longer searching for answers, but ready to accept them. Arthur did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door through which the general had entered, then back to the room. and when he finally spoke, it was quieter than before, but somehow carried even further. "Now," he said, "we see if the line still holds." And the words settled into the silence with a quiet finality that made it clear this moment was not the end of something remembered, but the beginning of something that was about to be tested again. No one moved when the words settled, not because they were unsure, but because something in the room had shifted beyond motion, beyond reaction, into a stillness that carried purpose. Arthur Hale stood quietly, his presence no longer an interruption, but a center point, something the room had unconsciously aligned itself around. And for the first time since the moment began, there was no tension left, only clarity. Captain Ryan Cole straightened fully, not out of habit, but out of understanding. His posture no longer driven by rank, but by respect earned in a matter of minutes that felt heavier than years, his voice steady when he spoke. "Then the line holds, sir." And the words did not sound rehearsed, they sounded chosen. General Maddox watched him closely, measuring the shift, and after a brief pause, he gave a single, firm nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the moment had done what it was meant to do. Staff Sergeant Grant stepped back into formation without being told. His eyes forward now, but his awareness sharper than before, as if something unseen had been placed into his hands, not physically, but in responsibility. The Marines followed without command, posture locking into place with a precision that no longer came from routine, but from intent, and the room, once filled with casual noise and passing attention, now carried a silence that felt earned. Arthur let his gaze move across them one last time, not searching, not testing, but recognizing, and there was a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that suggested the line had not been lost after all. He adjusted the worn edge of his jacket slightly, the faded patch catching the light for just a second before settling back into place, as if it had said everything it needed to without ever needing to be explained. General Maddox took one step back, restoring the space between them, but not the distance, his voice calm, steady, carrying the final weight of the moment. "Protocol remains active," he said, not as a command, but as a statement of fact, and the words settled into the room like a quiet seal placed on something that would not be undone. Captain Cole held his position, eyes forward now, no longer looking for answers, because he had already been given something more important than explanation. He had been given perspective. Arthur turned toward the door then, his movement unhurried, unannounced, as if leaving required no permission, and in a way, it did not, because nothing in that room outranked what he carried. The sound of his boots against the floor was soft, steady, fading as he moved away, but no one spoke, no one broke formation, because they understood that this was not an exit. It was a continuation of something that did not need an audience. The door closed quietly behind him, and the room remained exactly as it was for several long seconds, every man holding the line without being told, until finally, General Maddox lowered his hand, and with that single motion, the room exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. The briefing would continue, the day would move forward, orders would be given and followed, but something fundamental had shifted, something that would not be written in reports or recorded in logs, something that would live instead in the way they stood, the way they listened, the way they understood what it meant to hold a line that no one else could see. And long after the room returned to its routine, after the voices resumed and the systems quieted, one truth remained, carried in silence, stronger than any command, that respect is not demanded, it is recognized, and once seen, it is never forgotten.